Ready?
Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is born. While shepherds kept their watching, or silent floods by night, behold, throughout the heavens there shone a holy light. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is born. The shepherds feared and trembled when low above the earth rang out the angel chorus, and our Savior's birth. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is born. Down in a lonely manger, the humble Christ was born, and God sent us salvation, the blessed Christmas morn. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is born. Yeah, check. Real quiet. Evening, Mr. Autry. All right. Well, good evening. We're going to begin our time together tonight by singing Go Tell It on the Mountain. So let's stand together. Let's sing all three stanzas of Go Tell It on the Mountain. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is born. While shepherds kept their watching, their silent flocks by night, behold, throughout the heavens there shone a holy light. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere.
All right, we are continuing along in our study in Genesis. We're getting to a point in the book to where we're going to start moving through this a little bit more quickly. We're going to be looking tonight at Genesis chapters 15 through 18. We've been moving pretty slowly, and there will be some other times that we'll kind of slow down a little bit to focus in, but we're starting to get to some bigger narratives that we can kind of all knock out at once. But Genesis 15 through 18, the title of this tonight is God's Faithful Covenant with Abraham. And it's really easy, not just in the story of Genesis, but in a lot of these, to think that the main character, I don't really like using that term character because they're not characters, they're people, like this is real history. But, you know, the main focus of this is the person they're writing about, whether that's Noah, whether that's about Abraham, whether that's about Moses or Samuel or Elijah or any of the other ones. And while certainly that is a focus, the main emphasis is not necessarily on them. The main focus and emphasis is on God. And so while God makes his covenant with Abraham, and Abraham clearly is an important part of this, our main focus tonight is going to be about what does this covenant teach us about God? And then some of the other actions that came in after that covenant that resulted from it. But what are things that we can learn about God? And I've got several of them for y'all tonight. In chapter 15 is where we actually find that covenant. And in verses 1 through 16, actually, I think I've got 14 on there, but it's actually through 16. One thing we learn about God is that God's means do not always make sense. God's means, and what I mean by that, his means of fulfilling his promises, his means of showing faithfulness to us, do not always make sense to us. For instance, in chapter 15, beginning in verses 1 through 6, says, "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. 'Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great.' But Abram said, 'O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus.' And Abram said, 'Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir.' And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. 'This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir.' And he brought him outside and said, 'Look towards heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them.' Then he said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.' And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness." Now, by the time we get to verse 6, we see that faithfulness of Abraham, that ability and that willingness to believe the Lord and trust the Lord. But in those first 5 verses, there were doubts that was there. It had been years since chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, when he first made that covenant to where he says, "You're going to be the father of many nations, and your children shall be like the stars in the sky." And years and years and years, and he's not getting any younger. He was already old when that was said, and it's already difficult to believe, and now years had passed, and nothing. And we see that Abram had begun to doubt. But not only that, jump down with me to verse 12, verses 12 through 16. "As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, 'Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete.'" So Abraham, in verses 1 through 5, begins to doubt God just as we do. We know the promises of God. We know what God said, but we haven't begun to see that unfold in our lives. And so that seed of doubt pops up into our head about whether this is actually going to come true. And so he was confused, and he asked God questions about how this will come about. Verse 6, again, God answers him. He believed. But as we continue to read, God tells him in his answer something that was dreadful to him. Look, you are going to have children, and you are going to have a family, and they will be numerous like the stars in the sky, but they're all going to be slaves, and they're all going to live in slavery in Egypt for 400 years and be afflicted. 400 years of affliction living as slaves. Like, seriously, God, so you're going to wait until I'm over 100 years old, give me a child, and then send all my descendants into affliction into Egypt. Like, what sense does that make? Why even give me children and give me a lineage if that's the purpose of this lineage and what you're leading to happen? It was something he didn't understand and something he didn't like. Yet, verse 6 and the other things we read about Abraham believed God and he trusted God. One, when things didn't make sense in verses 1 through 5, when he didn't see how it was going to come out, and then in verses 12 through 16, when he finds out dreadful news. Still, Abram believed God. And oftentimes in our life, the same is true for us, is that we are called to believe God even when life does not make sense. We are called to trust God even when we can't figure out what was going on. And as we look at Abraham, up to this point and even following him after this point, is that he had a history of believing God in his life. God tells him something and he believes it. When we begin to believe God in the small things in life, the easier it's going to be to believe God and trust God in the big things. If when we've been dealing with small minor afflictions or small and minor difficulties in life, and we've trusted God and he's proven himself faithful through that, then when the big boy hits, it's going to be a lot easier to trust God when we have been practicing that trust in our lives as Abram had been doing up till this point. But again, we must not miss the focus of, or we must not miss who the focus of this passage is. It's not on Abram's ability to believe. The focus is on the Lord. Reminder, this chapter began not with Abraham believing, but with him doubting. And yes, I've mentioned there's lots of stories of Abraham's righteousness and Abraham's faithfulness and trust, but weaved into all of that is a lot of Abraham's sin. The doubts. There's lots of trust, but there's doubts as well. Him going through Egypt and another land too. This happened twice. And then his son Isaac repeated it, where he goes through, gets fearful. Mentioned this last week. Gets fearful. The king's going to see his beautiful wife and want to take her into his harem and kill Abraham to be able to do that. And so he says, if anybody asks, just tell them you're my sister. He was more concerned about his own safety, willing to let his wife be taken, and who knows what happens, just for his own safety. And so there's many pictures of Abraham's faithfulness. But listen, just like you and me, there's sin woven into that. And so the point of all of this is not for us to say, wow, look at Abraham's righteousness. The focus of this is God. Abraham doubted until the Lord asserted himself and responded. And it was then through the Lord's response that Abraham was strengthened to believe. Abraham doubted, he was confused, and then God came down and gave him a promise. To Abraham's credit, he believed it, but the focus of that is the promise of God and God interacting with Abraham, reasserting that promise and reminding him. And so our ability to trust through difficult times has nothing to do with our own ability to wump up enough faith. All right? As I'm meeting with people dealing with sin in their life, especially if it's a couple, and maybe one of them is struggling with sin more so than the other. And a lot of times the response from the one spouse who's not dealing with sin is, I just don't understand why they just don't pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, and why don't they just don't love me enough, or if they would just love me enough and love the Lord enough, then they wouldn't sin. Why don't they just get their act together and stop sinning? Well, if it was that easy, then all of us would do it. But that's the mindset we have, is if we have some trial in life, whether it's sin or difficulty, if I just really put in the work, then I can do it. But this isn't about Abraham putting in the work. This isn't about Abraham wumping up a good enough faith. It has nothing to do with our strength and our ability to persevere in difficulty. It has nothing to do with ourselves, and it has everything to do with God. I want to remind you of a verse that you guys know full well, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. That's the first line of it. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understandings. Your ability to persevere has nothing to do with your understanding of the situation. Your ability to persevere has nothing to do with you figuring it out, but it has everything to do with you trusting God and acknowledging Him during that trial. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understandings, another way, of your own abilities. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. Now, again, this isn't a just let go and let God situation to where I do nothing and God does everything for me, but I am actively placing my trust in God. It's not a passive thing. All right, God, you do everything for me, but I'm actively giving up control of this situation and placing my trust in the object of God Himself. And that's what Abraham was able to do. Yes, he had sin in his life, but that's what he was able to do. God, this doesn't make any sense to me, but you have proven yourself faithful. I don't know how it's going to happen. It's going to take a miracle. I've been waiting for years, but you're faithful, so I trust you. The object of his faith was not his own ability. The object of his faith was God's ability. And so our focus is there, not on, won't you just put in more work? Or if I could just put it, nope, it's God. We trust God. Second thing we learn about God from chapter 16 is that God is gracious. God is gracious. God sometimes uses means that we don't understand, that we don't expect. God is also gracious. This is another place to where Abraham did not show faithfulness, did not show righteousness. Again, chapter 15, verse 6, he trusted God, but look how quickly he began to doubt again. Again, just like us. It's up and down, up and down, up and down. They began to think, well, maybe, God, the heir is not going to be through the wife. It's going to be through some mistress. I mean, that's how foolish we get in our sin. That God has promised me a lineage through someone other than my wife. I mean, that makes no sense. If God is faithful, if God is righteous, why would He want you to do something that's sinful? Yet they justified their sin in their minds. They doubted God, so she said, why don't you take, or this is Sarah saying, why don't you take my maidservant Hagar and have a baby with her? As we know, that didn't turn out very well, because as soon as she got pregnant, Sarah got upset about the matter, understandably, and then didn't want Hagar to have anything to do with the family anymore. And so this is just a mess of a situation that began by by Abraham taking his view, taking his eyes off of God and back on the circumstances. Chapter 15, they were on God. Chapter 16, they're off God. Well, maybe God can't do it. Let me take matters into my own hands. Abraham, for the most part, is considered a very faithful person. Amazing trust in the promises of God. But even then, we see his weakness and we see his sin. But what we learn from this passage is that our sin does not affect God's promises. Our sin does not affect God's promises. We know how this story turned out. Abraham did get that child that God promised in the way that God promised through his wife, Sarah, not through a mistress, but through his wife. Did Abraham blow it? Yes, he did, but Abraham's sin did not affect the promises of God. I'm reminded of Exodus 33:19. This goes back to the story I've mentioned y'all before about Moses on Mount Sinai saying, God, show me your glory. And God says, okay, you can't see my face because if you see my face, you'll die, but I'll let you see my glory. But before he does, in verse 19, he qualifies it. Now, Moses, don't get a big head here. Don't think that I'm letting you see my glory because of how awesome and special and wonderful you are. He says, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious and merciful to whom I will be merciful. Paul then quotes that in Romans 9 as he's talking about our own salvation. God doesn't save us because, wow, look how awesome that person is. Hey, Moses is such a wonderful person. I'm going to let him see my glory. I've chosen Abraham and I'm going to fulfill my promise because look how awesome Abraham is. God says, I'll be gracious to whom I will be gracious and merciful to whom I will be merciful. It doesn't have anything to do with you. It has to do with God. And so a lot of times in life, we begin to think, we fall into that period of doubt, chapter 15, 1-5, or the time of sin, chapter 16, and we think, well, I've blown it. God can't do anything with me anymore. I'm living in sin. I've messed up. I'm out of the will of God. Now everything's ruined. I'm messed up. We can't live in fear of stepping outside of God's will and his blessing. There's a lot of people that function that way, that think that God's will is like a treasure hunt to where God's left clues. And for us to find what God really wants, I've got to go on this hunt, figuring out all these different clues, and then finally I'll get to it. And if I mess up at some point before I get to it, then I'm not going to get to it, and I'm outside of God's will. And then, oh no, I'm outside of God's will. And so we fear, what if I make the wrong decision? What if I sin? What if I do this? Then I'm going to be outside of God's will. And we're constantly living in fear, but that stems from a very theological term called stinking thinking, right? That's stinking thinking. That's wrong. In fact, it's sinful thinking. It's thinking that God's acceptance of us depends on our actions. That's what that stems from. Thinking that God's acceptance of us stems from our actions. And here's what I mean by that, is that we must realize that his love towards us is entirely of grace. That his love towards us rests completely upon the work of Jesus Christ and flows to us through our union with him. And yes, I do acknowledge that the Bible regularly calls us, choose this day whom you will serve. The Bible regularly lays before us a choice, calling us to turn from our life of sin and turn to Christ. But even our ability to do that is of God's grace in and of our own life. We were dead children of wrath. And so God is at work in us. And so even in me placing my faith in Jesus Christ, that is a result of God's work. And so his love towards us is entirely of grace. It rests completely upon the work of Jesus Christ flowing to us through our union with him. And in light of that, this is why this is so important. Because of that basis, his love towards me can never change. If his love towards me to begin with is not based off of me, but based off of Christ, then regardless of what sin or doubt I have in my life, his love for me doesn't change. Because the basis was never my righteousness to begin with, it was the righteousness of Christ. All of the blessings that flew to me were from Christ, not of my own doing. And so if my doing never brought on the blessings and righteousness, then when I am slipping up, I'm living in doubt, I'm living in sin, nothing has changed other than I'm dealing with the consequences of my sin. But God's love and the basis of that love is still the same, Jesus Christ. His love can never change regardless of what we do. That mindset also flows from the wrong view that I must work for God's blessing. Again, God's blessing is not based off of what we do. We will never be able to work enough for God's blessing. We work not to gain God's blessings, but we work because God is deserving of it. Our righteous living is an overflow of gratitude from my heart, not, well, I don't want to miss out on God's blessings today, so I better do what's right so I can get God's blessings. I want to stay in God's good graces. I better do what's right. Well, I'm tempted to sleep in this morning, but I want God to bless me, so I'm going to church. Right? Like we think those things. And now listen, there's a fine line here because the Bible tells us in the book of Proverbs, I think it's 15:19. I may be wrong. It's in the book of Proverbs. But it says the way of sinners is ruinous. There is great consequences to sin. Whereas in the book of James, James chapter 1, verse 25, says it's not the one who hears that is blessed, but it's the one who hears and does. He will be blessed in his doing, right? And so there is blessings that naturally flow from doing what God says. This is the best way to live. If you live this way, life is going to go a lot better for you. If you live the way that God says is worst, you can expect ruin. Like, we know that. But for me to think, well, I got to go to church today because God won't bless me if I don't, we're thinking that I can do enough to merit God's blessings in my life. But that's not right. The merit of God's grace and his blessings and his favor is not me, it's Jesus. And this story of Abraham exemplifies why this is so important. God had made this covenant with Abraham, God had made this promise, and Abraham royally blew it. Listen, if I did what Abraham did, y'all would be finding a new pastor, right? I mean, it's easy to just read over here like, oh, Abraham slept with a servant girl. And he slept with a servant girl. He had an affair and had an illegitimate child with her. That's kind of a big deal. Yet we're so used to it, we just blow by it. Like, that's not okay. And yet it changed nothing. Why? Because the covenant is based off of God's righteousness, not Abraham's. And that's reassuring to us, not for us to take it for granted, like, woohoo, I can sin. Like, nope, those who are truly saved are going to have gratitude for that and live a life of repentance to God. But when I do blow it, it's like, phew, man, thank you that my blessings and my grace from God is not based off of all of that, but it's based off of Christ. Some examples of this. Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 4 through 6. Deuteronomy 9, 4 through 6. God is telling them why he chose the nation of Israel. Why he chose the nation of Israel. Deuteronomy 9, 4 through 6. Do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, and also why he's giving them the promised land as opposed to other people. So do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. So another way of saying it is, don't say, when I bless you, don't say, it's because of how righteous I am that God blessed me. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out from before you, and that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Know therefore that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stubborn people. Then 2 Corinthians 5:21, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Again, my righteousness is not based on anything that I've done. My righteousness is based off everything Christ did. So therefore, I can never merit more blessing than the merit I have already received through Christ. It's based off of God's grace. And so as I'm living this life, going through difficulty, going through trial, going through affliction, and I'm needing the grace of God, I don't have to fear, man, I blew it. Just trust the grace of God. God is a gracious God. Third thing we learn is that God sees the need of his people. Genesis 16, 7 through 16. This is the Lord's interaction with Ishmael and Hagar. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur, and he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all kinsmen. All right? So God saw Ishmael and Hagar. God heard their cries in the midst of affliction. One of our memory verses recently this year, Psalm 31:7, I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love, because you have seen my affliction and you know the distress of my soul. So as I'm going through difficulty, I know that the Lord has a plan, even if that plan makes no sense to me. I'm perplexed, but as Paul says, not driven to despair. God gives me grace, not based off of my perfection, but based off of Christ. So I don't have to fear blowing it and messing up in the midst of this trial. And all the while, I trust that God sees and that God is with me. We then look at Genesis 17. Genesis 17, 1 through 8, and then verses 15 and 16 as well, is that God has authority. God has authority. In this passage, God renames Abram and Sarai and gives them the names they're most well known by, Abraham and Sarah. Why is God renaming them? This is important. Why is God renaming them? He does the same thing with Jacob when he renames him Israel. We go back to Genesis 2. As God is creating the world, he's bringing all of the animals before Adam, and Adam is naming them. Why? Because remember, God gave Adam dominion over the animals. Another way of saying that is God gave Adam authority over the animals. And the one with authority has the right to name them the same way Layla is having a baby, hopefully tonight or early in the morning. Layla and Timothy chose the name of that baby. Why? Because they're the ones with authority. Nobody else gets to decide. You can put in suggestions, but they don't care. They're naming the baby what they want, right? Because they have authority. Why is God renaming Abram and Sarai? Because he has authority. This is a sign of his dominion and his authority. He's reminding them as this baby is getting ready to be born, listen, this is not about you, this is about me. His covenants and his promises are on his terms, not ours. God has authority. We don't come to God in our own terms. We don't relate to God in our own terms, but on God's. The one who has authority is the one who's in control. So think about this, right? Who cares if the one who sees and the one who knows has no ability to do anything about it? I mean, that's good for nothing. I mean, maybe a shoulder to cry on, put their arm around you, but they can't. Who cares if you see and you know if you can't do anything about it? God sees, God knows, and he's the one with authority. He's the one who can do something about it. In the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 16:9. Proverbs 16:9, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. How many times have we made plans in our life? We've had everything planned out, and the Lord's just chuckling all the way. Not a single one of those plans played out the way that you wanted it to. There's nothing wrong with making plans, as long as we hold those plans loosely. And we're Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. God, this is what I want, but not my will, but your will be done. There's nothing wrong with plans as long as we trust that sometimes, maybe even oftentimes, or most of the time, God is going to have a different but better plan. Proverbs 19:21, very similar. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. You can have a lot of plans, but just because you have a plan doesn't mean it's going to stand. But since the Lord is the one with authority, what he says goes. And so his plans are the ones that stand. But again, that's good. That's comfort. Why? Because he sees, he knows. He knows what I'm going through. He knows what's best for me. His plans are much better. Sunday morning was one of those mornings to where we woke up with 4 children, and by the time coming to church, we almost had less children. You know, whether we just left them on the side of the road for somebody else to pick up or, whatever. It was one of those mornings to where you get out of the car and you put on the smiling face, like everything's fine. So Elijah was the issue this Sunday morning, and Hillary and Elijah are going at it. I'm in the bathroom brushing my teeth, like listening to all of this, like right outside the bathroom door. And Hillary's handling it well, probably better than I would have. And finally, I get done brushing my teeth and I open the door and I say, Elijah, listen, me and your mom, we love you. And as a result of us loving you, we want what's best for you. It is not our goal as your parents to make your life miserable. It is not our goal to do what is worst for you and to be mean for you. We love you and we care about you. We want what's good. We are just a lot older than you, which means, I know as a teenager, you think us being older means we don't know anything, but what really it means is that we know a whole lot more than you. And so you need to trust that me and your mom have your best interest in mind. And in light of that, you need to trust us. And it's the same with God. God has authority. God sees and God knows. God is a gracious God who loves us and he cares about us. And so there are times that this isn't going to make sense, but I'm going to say, all right, my authority figure, he knows what's best for me. He loves me. He cares about me. I'm going to trust him. I'm going to go with this. We continue in chapter 17. Is that God sometimes asks us to do difficult things. This is the story of the circumcision. Again, it's easy for us to just read over this. I don't want to be crass in talking about this, but circumcision's now. It's like a few hours after the baby's born, so there's no memory there. They've got anesthetic. Abraham's a grown man. Ishmael's 13 when this happens. Isaac's a baby. But there's a call, like, look, for this covenant to stand, you're going to need to circumcise both yourself and your own family. There's not surgical equipment to do this. It's easy for us to read over this and be like, oh, yeah, Jews had to circumcise themselves. Like, this is a big thing. This is a different, like, hold on, God, you want what? Like, let's take a step back here. Abraham was faithful even when it was painful. Abraham was faithful even when it was painful. And there are going to be times in life that whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, is that God is going to ask us to do things that are hard. And yet we're still expected to do it. And not only that, but Abraham went through with the circumcision even before seeing the promise fulfilled. I mean, he had no option at that point that this was going to happen. There was a baby that had been promised. The angel came and said that it was going to happen. But there was no fulfillment of having an entire lineage. And yet Abraham obeyed even before he saw. Obedience is not always easy. What he asks us to do is regularly hard, but God will never ask us to do more than what Christ did. God will ask us to do some hard things, but he's never going to ask us to do more than Christ did. And here's what I mean by that. All right, Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. We know that Jesus was without sin. We also know that as a man, he was tempted in every way that we are. It doesn't mean he was tempted with every single sin, but the heart of every temptation, Jesus faced that. I mean, Jesus couldn't be tempted with yearning for cocaine because cocaine wasn't a thing then, right? But desiring things that he shouldn't. Jesus faced the heart of those things, yet Jesus was without sin. He never gave in to that temptation. Now, Hebrews 12:4. Begin in verse 3 for context, because it's important too. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In our times of obedience, we're tempted to weariness, we're tempted to be faint-hearted. We're saying, I can't do this anymore. God, I cannot go on this that you're asking me to do. I can't do. God says, consider Jesus. What are we to consider about Jesus? Verse 4, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. What's he talking about? The Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus sweating drops of blood. The pressure that was upon him was so great. Most scientists believe, Christian medical people believe that because this can happen, and it's happened, is that pressure gets upon you so greatly the capillaries in your face can burst and you literally begin to sweat drops of blood. Jesus was upon such great temptation, he began to sweat drops of blood. And when we say, I can't do it, listen, I hear people tell me all the time. In fact, I heard it today. I've done everything. What I told the person today, I read them this verse, Hebrews 12:4. Have you resisted temptation to the point of shedding blood? Have you shed blood yet? Nope, then you have not done everything. Consider Jesus. And here's why we consider Jesus, is because the same Holy Spirit who was inside of Jesus that allowed him to resist temptation up to that point is the same Holy Spirit that's inside of you. And so consider Jesus. When you say, I can't do it, consider Jesus. I mean, you can't do it in and of your own power, but the Holy Spirit within you, who also empowered Jesus for him to be faithful, is the one who can empower you to do this hard, difficult task that God has called you to do. You can be obedient in the power of God. Next, verses 15 through 21 is God is powerful to carry out his promises. Verses 15 through 21, God is powerful to carry out his promises. Abraham 99, Sarah 90, they have a child. That is only through a miracle. God is omnipotent. God is powerful. So again, God sees and he knows. God has authority or sovereignty. He's omnipotent. He's gracious. He's good. He's loving. So I've mentioned this to y'all before, but to remind you of it, a lot of times we look at the attributes of God. It's kind of like you're sitting on a three-legged stool, right? If you were to remove one of those legs, you can't stand on those other two. You're going to fall. And it's the same with this. As we look at God and God being omnipotent, all-powerful, we need several other things with that, all right? Part of that power, I'm going to put his authority and sovereignty in that, but we need God's omniscience and omnisapience, his infinite knowledge and wisdom, and also his infinite goodness, all right? How terrifying would it be to have an omnipotent God who is not good, right? Likewise, who cares how good he is if he doesn't have the power to do anything about it? Who cares how good and powerful he is if he doesn't know what to do? And so as we look at this and we're building our lives, God is the foundation upon which I build my lives. It's like that three-legged stool. I'm resting upon all of those. I need all of those attributes. And as I look at this, God promised all of these things, and then God's powerful to carry it out. And then lastly, chapter 18, God is faithful in carrying out his promise. Sometimes slow, but still faithful. God is faithful in carrying out his promise. Sometimes slow, but faithful. All right, 2 Peter 3, 8 through 9. We're going to get to pretty soon on Sunday mornings. It's a passage you guys know. But again, as I've been teaching on Sundays, the scoffers were saying, there's no judgment, the Lord's not going to return. But Peter says, do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. So in some ways, what I titled this point is wrong. All right, God is faithful in carrying out his promise, sometimes slow, but faithful. God's never slow. God's always right on time. The issue is he's slower than we prefer. We're too impatient for God's timetable. And so God is faithful in carrying out his promise. Sometimes slower than we would like, would be a better way of putting it, but still faithful. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 3, I've mentioned this. God, why are you idly sitting by doing nothing? I am doing something. You wouldn't understand it. We talked about that here. Abraham saying this doesn't make any sense. Habakkuk saying this doesn't make any sense. God reaffirms Habakkuk, look, I am doing something, but if it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. God is faithful. And our trust to persevere through difficulties has nothing to do with our own ability, but has everything to do with the object of our faith, the perfecter, the finisher of our faith, Jesus Christ. He started it. He's the one who carries us through. He's going to be the one who finishes it. And so our faith is never on us, but is on Christ throughout all of it. All right. So with that, we're going to move to our prayer time. Those of you who are with us at home, we appreciate you joining us. All right, prayer time.